This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, we're glad to have you with us again for another episode of the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. Thank you all for listening. We hope that we're helping take your leadership to the next level. And here to do that, as always, is Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Good to be with you, Sam. Sam, you're heading off to the airport here in just a few hours.
We're headed to the airport. We're going to do a quick 16-day trip through parts of Europe. And
I tell you what impresses me is not the 16 days in Europe, but is Claire 7 months old?
8 months old.
8 months old. You're going for 16 days,
Yep.
and you're not checking any luggage.
Not checking. We're in the carry-on only club.
There's two adults and a baby, no checked luggage for 16 days in Europe. That I'm impressed.
Well, it takes some doing.
I can't drive to Walmart without at least some carry-on luggage. So that's good.
No,
for
well,
you.
we've just learned that it's just such a hassle to check luggage.
We may have to just do a podcast for you sometime. And for listeners who don't know, my daughter Carrie and Sam they travel all the time, and they have made it just a point of traveling the world. And by the time their daughter Claire is a year old, how many countries will she have been in already?
I believe it's 10.
10 countries by her first birthday. And the goal tell us what the Century Club is.
Well, for those who don't know, the Century Club is basically a club for people who have been to at least 100 countries. And they have their way of defining what a country is, which is perhaps different than maybe what the UN defines it as. And it's basically just a club for travelers to come and talk about.
And so by what age do you hope to have Claire in the Century Club?
Well, we thought it might be a good challenge to get her in there before she graduates high school.
So by at least 18 to have been in 100 countries.
Yeah.
So I think that's worthy of a podcast sometime. I certainly encourage our listeners to travel. There's so much that can happen. Certain travels, it could be expensive, but the way you guys do it, you found cheap ways to do it.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, if you're listening to that, Sam and Carrie have a blog about travel that gives you all kinds of tips. And what is that?
It's called Maple and Maps.
Mapleandmaps.com.
You can go read some about our travels, and we hope to always, inspire others to travel, because we think it's a great learning experience, as well as just a great experience to see new cultures and places.
And for kids, there's few things more educational than just seeing that the world's bigger than just the little town that you grew up in. So.
And that's our hope and prayer for our little girl, and it's what we try to do. And
it helps that Carrie, my daughter, grew up in a home of an international traveler, and
that's true.
You had a dad who worked for Delta Airlines and could travel for free. So
that probably is where the sparks began, but it wasn't until really just maybe 4 years ago that we really started travel hacking, as they call it, using miles and finding really cheap airfare. So we're flying to Europe round trip for $290 each, and that seems crazy, and
that's
it kind
amazing.
of is crazy, actually.
Yeah.
But
you must have a really good boss that gives you lots of flexibility in travel.
That it doesn't hurt. I'll say that.
Well, that's great.
Enough about all that.
Enough about you.
Enough about me.
Okay.
I'll stop it. Today, what are we looking at, Richard?
I want to talk about the power of stories. Stories, if you've ever read much on leadership, the storytelling ability inevitably comes up.
So, Richard, I guess the question is, why do stories have so much power?
Well, I think there's several reasons for it. And, I'm a professional speaker. I travel around. I use PowerPoints. I've preached sermons and given talks straight off my notes. But my experience has been that the moment I begin telling a story, I might have been highly engaged in presenting my material before that time, but I literally notice the moment I start going into a story, people's heads pop up. People that have been looking at their cell phone or dozing off or whatever they were doing, I can physically just see. If I were just showing you a video of the audience, you could tell by watching when a story began to be told, because people's heads go up, people lean in. There's just something, and there's a reason for that. One is I think people just realize that the oldest form of communication is in stories.
Yeah.
I think perhaps even before people were talking, they were miming out stories and communicating with what happened. If I ask you, for instance, when you come back from Europe in 16 days, and I ask, well, how'd it go? You're not going to start giving me a bunch of data. We flew X number of miles and we're gone this many days and hours. You start telling me stories about, well, when we were here, we did this and then we did that. And our minds we think in terms of stories.
Right.
That's, I think, how we store a lot of our information. So,
right.
So stories are so basic. And, the interesting thing, like I've spoken in a number of different cultures, and you do have to be careful. I just came back from Bulgaria this week.
Yeah.
And
speaking of world traveling,
and and so when you're telling a story, you always have to try to think, okay, I have to be careful. I don't tell sort of culturally, specific details that they won't understand in Bulgaria. You have to be careful about that. But I found that when I tell a similar story, whether it's in the Philippines or Brazil or England or wherever I might be, I get the same response. People just engage with stories. It's a cross-cultural kind of thing, as long as you don't get too bogged down in cultural sort of specifics. But when I'm talking about a relationship with my son, for instance, well, parents are everywhere, and they all have sons or kids, and they identify with that. And so
they can relate to that.
I think I mentioned, but I think before a book, the Leadership Challenge, which is kind of a standard work on leadership, and as a textbook, but they cited an interesting study where they did an experiment with a group of engineers, and they made 3 presentations to the same group of engineers. And in one case, the person just got up, cited a bunch of statistics and so on, just verbally made a report. In the second case, they used PowerPoint and had graphs and charts and so on. And then the third one, they just simply told stories. Well, after that, they came back and they tried to find out how much of the information did these engineers remember. Well, hands down, they remembered the stories far, far better than they remembered the charts or the graphs or the information.
Yeah.
And these are engineers. These are not these aren't English majors or literature majors. These are people who think in statistics and numbers and so on. And yet, even stories have a way of lodging in our memory, and they're easy to recall.
Yeah, they're memorable.
And so I go back, I'll maybe speak somewhere, and I've come back 5 years later, and people will say, I still remember that story you told. Now, they may not remember if it was a sermon type presentation. They may not remember the scripture I used, may not remember a lot of things, but they remember the story. And if they remember the story, then they typically in a good story is embedded a major point. And so if they remember the story, then they'll say, and I remember that your point was, and it lodges there. And partly because a story engages both your mental ability, the facts, the information, but it also engages your emotions. And I think that's why it lodges so much better.
Yeah.
A lot of information, even a PowerPoint, doesn't necessarily engage your emotions. It's facts, it's information.
Right.
But stories have a way of appealing to your emotions, and that makes them far, far more powerful than if you just give someone some facts. And so basically, the reason we're talking about this is I feel that leaders have got to be good storytellers. Because if you're going to communicate the vision of your organization, if you're going to communicate the direction, if you're going to address the culture of your organization and talk about how you want to treat people, what's important to you, the kind of interactions that you're looking for among the staff and so on, then you've got to be able to communicate that. No, don't just put up a poster saying these are 10 things that we'll do around this office.
Bullet point list.
Yeah, that doesn't work nearly as well as what I would say to a leader is, if you've got, say, 10 things that are like, these are the 10 core values or the 10 most important things about how we function as a group, then I would say have a story that illustrates every one of those. Have a key story, and tell the story often. Keep going back and saying, I know you guys have heard this story before, but it illustrates so well how we want to treat our customers, or how we want to work together, how we want to learn and grow together. And so, I'm going to just keep telling this story. And basically, good leaders tell those key stories so often that all the staff could tell the story for you. And, and I think oftentimes people will say, if you haven't communicated until you're sick of communicating, you haven't communicated enough. And so just keep telling those stories, and it embeds in people's minds. Now, if you share like a mission statement, or you share these are our 5 core values or whatever, people may sometimes have trouble recalling those. But if you have a story that symbolizes each of those core values, they'll remember the stories even long after they don't work for your organization anymore.
That's that is incredible, that the way that stories affect us and make us remember the things that we otherwise would forget.
Whether at home, on the job, or in the ministry, we can all have a greater impact on the world around us for the kingdom of God. Join Richard Blackaby at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove to learn about increasing your spiritual influence on April 6th through the 8th, 2020. Space is limited, so register soon at the link in the show notes.
I get your point.
I can tell you a story about that if you like.
That reminds me of a story. So I see that, and I think those listening would agree that there's no doubt power in stories, and you say that if a good leader needs to know how to communicate in stories, the vision, whatever the messaging is to those they're leading. So if there is a leader who perhaps would say they are not good at telling stories, they don't have that. They're not a storyteller for whatever reason. Are there ways for them to become a good storyteller? Because that seems like a real key point in kind of taking that communication to the next level, at least.
Well, whether you become a good storyteller or not is maybe up to question, but whether you can become a better storyteller is without a doubt. And so
fair enough.
I would say if you're not just natural, and I suppose there are some people that are just good at spinning a yarn, just telling a story, and you see them in parties, and they've got a bunch of people listening as they're telling some hilarious story about what happened to them at work the other day. But I would say anybody can improve, and several things I would share about that. And as I've already basically explained, you need to improve. You need to get better. Even if you're a good storyteller, you could get better. And so a number of just things I've learned in my own experience. And by the way, it's interesting because I've had some people say, and I mean, you have to be careful about this, but like, for instance, when I preach a sermon, I'll always have a couple of stories in there. Now, I've had some kind of conservative people say, well, you don't need to be telling your own stories in a sermon. You need to just preach the Bible. Your story is not going to change anyone's life, but the Bible will, which is true. But it's interesting because if Jesus is our model,
right,
he sure told a lot of stories. And he was the Son of God. He is the Word incarnate. I mean, if there's anybody who could have just said, here's how it is, here's the truth, it would have been Jesus. Yet he's constantly telling stories. And some of the most famous stories in human memory, certainly in Western civilization, are parables he told. So Jesus seemed to be onto something in terms of storytelling. And so you may not be as good as Jesus, but there's certainly some things you can do to get better. And so let me just kind of throw some out there just in my own experience. And the first thing I would just say is that telling a good story involves energy. I've had times where maybe I'm jet lagged, maybe I've just flown all the way through 7 time zones, and now I've got to get up and speak. And there's some stories that it takes energy to tell a good story.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if you're going to just tell a story in a monotone voice with no energy, no enthusiasm, it's just, even though it's a story, it's going to fall flat.
Yeah.
To tell a good story, you've got to be engaged. And I've literally changed sermons and presentations sometimes because I honestly didn't think I had the energy to tell this particular story. This is a story that involves moving around the platform a bit and getting enthusiastic and raising your voice and whatever. And there are just days I don't think I could pull that one off adequately with my current energy level, and I'll have to kind of tone down the story a bit. So if you're going to tell a story, get into it and put some energy into it. Don't be just mundane, lethargic, monotone. Get involved in the story.
And I think that's something that you do so well when you are engaging in that story. And I've seen you speak a number of times, and I think that is, without a doubt, I think one of the highlights of your teaching and your speaking is just that engagement that you have with the audience when you're telling those stories. And that's a full body, full mental experience.
You're all in. And but like I said, I can watch you engage people, and that's why my typical style is to often start a presentation with a story. That's my preferred method. And part of that is, and I would say my preferred method typically is start out with a humorous story, because if you can get them laughing, you can get them crying. You're engaging them. The moment that you affect people's emotions, whether it's to cry or to laugh, to smile, the walls have just come down. Barriers have come down between the listener and the speaker. And so even if you're just going to give a pep talk to the staff on Monday morning, begin by telling maybe a humorous story and get them engaged, laughing, let the barriers, the walls come down a bit, and now you get to the meat of what it is you want to say. So show some energy. A second thing I would say is, and this is just cardinal rule, but just desperately avoid unnecessary details. I can't think of anything that kills a good story more than someone that's just a detail and you know those people that need to tell you all the details and the huge preamble to the story
and the rabbit trails
and and my wife and I have a joke that we tell, which is, I think it comes from just being around some older friends of ours, and they'll, in our little joke we always say is no, I think that was the Tuesday, and they're starting out to say, well, last Monday when I was going to the store, no, I think that was Tuesday, and my mother will do this, and I'll just say, Mom, it doesn't matter, Monday, Tuesday, that's not the point of the story. What happened? But when you get
to the meat.
And so, but the kiss of death for a good story is needless details. I just want to keep saying it doesn't matter. What day it was doesn't matter. Now there's certain details that do matter. And I'd also say if you skip, now I pick up my mother, but she's now horrendous. I mean, she's 80, so we'll give her some grace here. But she'll leave out. She'll just say, and then he said, it's like, wait, who said? Who are you talking about? It's important to know who it is we're talking about, but it's not important to know if it was a Monday or a Tuesday. So, just like get the key details. And so, in fact, sometimes if you're really working on this, write out your story and then look at the story and say, okay, now what can I delete here?
Yeah.
What can I delete from this story? Because a story that goes too long, it's very. Now I've told a couple of longer stories, but they're especially a lot of work because you gotta keep them engaged. And so the best thing to do is cut out extraneous details that aren't necessary, and say, okay, now what can I cut? Let's keep this tight. Let's keep it moving. Let's keep it flowing. And so if you want to be, I just tell you, if you have trouble telling stories, you're probably giving too much. You're taking too long. So first thing is cut it down, keep it concise, keep it moving. And if you're going to be telling maybe several stories, it's always good to vary the emotions. And that's why I say, if you really have a heart-wrenching sermon, a deep point you want to make, it doesn't necessarily hurt to start by getting them to laugh.
Yeah.
And the moment they've laughed, they've just let their guard down.
Right.
Their emotions are engaged now in your sermon. And if you can have them laughing early on in your message, it's far, far easier to get them very serious and sober once you're getting to the main thrust of it all. But if you haven't engaged their emotions early on, then when you want to get to that more serious point, they won't go there with you either because they're still entrenched. Their emotions aren't engaged yet. So don't be careful you don't use too much humor. If you're just cracking one joke after another, then all of a sudden you want to hit them with a serious point, that doesn't work. But if you start off with maybe some humor and then you begin to transition to the real heart of the matter. Yeah. And I've had a lot of people talk to me about that when they listen to my sermons. And one of the things people have often said is, you just had me laughing at the edge of my seat one moment, the next moment I'm crying like a baby. I'd say, well, I'm not trying to manipulate you, but I just know that I've got to engage you. And so vary the emotions, and I just say practice telling a story. There are times if I'm going to speak somewhere, I've literally paced around my hotel room that morning and just talk through the story, because this is the problem. Sometimes you think about a story and you think, yeah, I know the details of that story. I was there. I know what happened.
Yeah.
But until you start actually verbally telling the story, you don't realize that you'll hit certain transitional points in the story where I have to think, okay, now what's a good way of saying that? Or as I'm kind of talking it through, I realize, oh, okay, wait a minute here. I'm going down a rabbit trail. This is taking too long. This isn't necessary. Let me back up. And instead, I'll just say this and move on. And so practice telling the story. Don't wait. Don't say, well, I remember what I did on my vacation last summer. I don't need to practice that. But you do need to practice that, because you got to think through, what can I cut out?
I wonder if that familiarity with a story can be almost deceptive if you're telling it, because you, in your own mind, you think, well, that's so easy because I lived it.
You don't practice as much.
So you don't practice it, and then your transitions fall flat. Your punchline is not there, and those probably stories that you know the best are probably the ones you need to practice the most.
Because sometimes I'll tell someone else's story. Maybe it's a story in history of someone. Henry Ford did this one time. Well, then I'm paying a lot more attention to, okay, I got to make sure I've got the details right.
Right.
When was this? Who was it he said this to, and so on. But when it's your own story, you can get a little more careless. And those often are the stories that go on way too long.
Yeah, shooting from the hip is...
You're telling way too much information. You've lost the audience. I'd also say just get feedback. And that's hard. And if you have self-esteem issues, it's especially hard. But have people that give you feedback afterward about how'd that story go. And again, we've mentioned this before, but if you really want to be brutal, just like get a video of your story and then listen to you tell the story, and keep asking yourself, did I need to say all that? Did I miss a key point? Was I monotone all the way through that story? And one of the great things to do too is watch good storytellers. There are people who are great storytellers. I don't think it's an accident that Abraham Lincoln is considered one of the greatest presidents in American history, perhaps the greatest, but he's also probably one of the very best storytellers. Mm-hmm. And Abraham Lincoln seemed to have a story for everything. When it was a real tense moment, they just had a setback, or some problem was occurring. It seemed as if Abraham Lincoln always had a story that changed the mood of the room, that shed light, that inspired, but a well-told story, I think goes a long ways to great leadership. I'd also just say, who some of the best storytellers of all are comedians.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking of this whole time.
I love comedians, and the thing is, and this is what's great about really good comedians is that they're not talking about some exotic thing. When I was like swimming with great white sharks, or like when I was skydiving at 30,000 feet, like they're not. That's not usually what's humorous. That's not what engages people. It's typically when they tell stories about everyday life.
Yeah, going to the grocery store.
Yeah, and
whatever.
It's like everybody's done that. Everybody's had a cranky kid, or everybody's gone to the store. Everyone's had to wait in line. Yeah, everyone's had someone cut them off in traffic. And so when they start just talking so watching what they do, they're talking about ordinary life that everyone can relate to, but they see something that is true, but we hadn't noticed. Or it's just a different perspective on everyday life. And the best comedians are people everybody in the room can identify, but they'd never thought about it like that. But sure enough, as they're hearing it, they're nodding their heads saying, that's right. That's exactly what I've experienced. And they identify and they laugh and they feel one with the comedian. They feel like this guy knows me. We're connected here. And so it's great just to watch what comedians do with that, because they're great at telling stories, and the details all matter. And sometimes you tell detail, and at first it's not obvious even why you told it, but before you wrap the story up,
that comes back.
And so some things I find too is if you can build a surprise. I mean, not every stories are different, but I've got some stories where it's a funny surprise ending. It's like you think you're following, and I know
where
this.
I see where this is
going, and then bam. You get hit with a completely different ending, and everybody, you can just see the reaction on people's face, and it's memorable. When you surprise people, you shock them, then they remember that. I think humor has a way of embedding a story into your memory, just like tears can as well. But humor is something everybody loves a good story. And you go anywhere in the world, and people are telling funny stories to their friends, their family. So if I have a choice between telling a sad story or a funny story, I'll tend to go to the funny story. Unless I've already told 2 other funny stories, that maybe you need to change it up. But funny, but add a little humor to your stories. They make them more memorable. And one other thing just to say about that, and that I've really tried to work on as well, is just be candid and honest in stories. If you're going to tell one of your own stories, don't always make the story about how you were the hero. Everybody else gave up. No one else could solve the problem, but you saw through it all, and you came to the rescue. People will get tired of those stories in a hurry. But you talk about messing up, getting it wrong, coming back and apologizing to your son or to your wife when you realized you'd messed up, and what you learned and how you were humbled. Boy, I tell you what, everybody's connecting with you because they've all been there. They've all made mistakes. And so it makes you real. And if you're a preacher especially, don't put yourself on some pedestal where you're afraid for people to know that you're not perfect, that you're not sinless, but that you're a human being who's striving to be more like Jesus, just like everybody else. And the moment you start kind of showing some of your own shortcomings and you admit that you're not perfect, you struggle, that you fail, those are stories that people remember. And I'll tell you what, I've got lots of those stories, and when I start to tell a story where I just messed up, maybe I just lost my temper or whatever I did, and I realized I'd blown it, I realized I was just a jerk there, and I just hate it when I act that way. I'll tell you what, you get to the end of your presentation, you've got people in tears coming up to you saying, I've had people that could hardly speak. They were so moved, and not just by my story, but it reminded them of one of their stories.
Right.
They identified, and I tell you what, it can be incredibly impactful. And so lots to say about storytelling. I've kind of made it a bit of a science for me, but as a leader, if I just kind of circle back around, I'd say anything that you really want to be bedrock to who your organization is or your family, then think of a story that embodies that value, that principle, and then don't just always list all the rules. Tell a story that helps make sense of the rule, and people will remember those rules, and they may even value the rule more because now you put flesh on it.
Right.
Just saying, we don't do this around here. Well, that may be true, but when you tell a story and it becomes obvious why you don't do that around there, because it's hurt people in the past, and you just don't want to have any more of those kind of stories where people got hurt like that time. Well, I'll tell you what, then all of a sudden people are like, yeah, I get that. Yeah, I can see why you have that rule. Boy, if I'd been there when that happened, I wouldn't want to do that either. So all of a sudden it puts a face, it puts emotion to facts and rules and principles, and it's just a much more powerful way to lead. So let me just conclude by saying you may not see yourself as a gifted storyteller. It's worth the effort. Get around someone who's good, even get a coach if you have to. Videotape yourself, watch it, and get someone to show you where you could have cut this. Why weren't you smiling there? You could have said the same thing in a more humorous way. You can get better if you want to be. So don't resign yourself just to being a bad storyteller, where you just always lay out the facts and you never engage. Strive to be better, and every year be better. And I'll tell you what, as you get better at telling stories, you'll get better at leading.
Well, man, storytelling and leadership is not something you would necessarily put together at first glance, but I think it is such an important fact of leadership to be able to communicate. And we've got a couple of books here I just want to mention before we wrap up, at just sort of a takeaway for our listeners to perhaps read and become better storytellers themselves. The first one is Leading Out Loud by Terry Pearce, Inspiring Change Through Authentic Communication. And the second is The Secret Language of Leadership by Stephen Denning.
And those are a couple of leadership books that I've read over the years that just talk about the power of communication, that leading by talking and using your words well. And so I think leaders ought to always be studying the words they use, whether it's in stories or other ways, but words have power. If you want to be a more powerful leader, develop the ability to speak powerful words.
I think that's a great place to stop.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.